called opportunity costs. And whenever we're talking about costs of the firm from here on out, I want you to imagine or to realize that what we really are talking about is our opportunity cost of operating or opportunity cost of producing that particular product. And if you remember long ago, I mentioned that when we're thinking about or revenue, when we're thinking about the revenue, you're thinking about the firm's revenue based on the sales for that particular product that they produce. So in similar sense, when you think about the cost, you want to be thinking about the cost of producing that particular product. And what I'm saying here is that that cost includes not just your explicit costs, but also your implicit costs that's involved. And to keep in mind that when you use your resources to produce a particular level of output, then you're recognizing that you're giving up the use of your resources to do something else. And if you notice, when I talked about the implicit cost last class, I mentioned foregone opportunities, and I talked about the owner's capital and the owner's labor, the owner's time, and that there are foregone opportunities associated with using these resources in the production of your good or service, and these resources, and these are foregone opportunities, are part of your opportunity cost. So if I put the cost continued. So, you know, when we talk about our opportunity cost, it's the same as your economic cost. And it's also then your implicit plus your explicit cost. So when we think about, and I hesitate to use the word accounting costs, but when you think about just the cost of operating your business from an accounting perspective, from the idea of money coming in and money coming out, so mayhap we should say business costs. When you think about the business costs, usually you just think about money coming in and money coming out that you're actually seeing. And so you would calculate that as your revenue minus your explicit cost. But for us, when we talk about, and you call that economic profit. So when you think about your business profit, when you think about your business profit, we just think about explicit costs, and we think about revenue minus explicit costs. But when we talk about your economic profit, then your economic profit will be your revenue minus your opportunity cost. So here, I mean, I know the textbook and other books like to talk about accounting costs, but accounting profit, but it gets a little bit tricky because the accountants among us will mention that there are other revenue sources and cost sources that are not being included. But and so here I want to just say here business profit so that we understand that I care only about the resources or being used to produce a particular good, the particular product, as well as the revenue that is coming from that particular product. So this is equal to your total revenue. Remember, I mentioned that it is remember I mentioned that this is our total sales minus your explicit cost. But when we economists, and that's what we are once we're in this class, what we care about is your economic profit. And I'm gonna give you a visual of what it really measures for us. And this economic profit is total revenue minus your opportunity cost. And so what your economic profit does for you, it tells us about whether this is a good thing for you to do and giving up what considering what you have given up to do this particular business. So let's say, for example, I decided to quit my job and I decided to operate 2 food trucks. And I'm operating 2 food trucks. I have one station somewhere on Lexington, mayhap right there by Starbucks between 24th and 23rd. And I have another food truck. I decided to put this food truck somewhere on Broadway because it seems like everyone's walking along Broadway. And maybe I choose on Broadway, somewhere near 29th Avenue, just before you get to the train station or something like that. That's where people are actually going to be. So when you think about, I decide I'm going to quit and I'm going to start my business. From an accounting perspective or from a business perspective, my accountant, let's say, would tell me whether the food trucks are generating enough revenue to cover the costs being incurred from operating the food truck. So my accountant will be telling me whether I spend money buying inputs, materials, etc., and labor, and I use this to operate my food truck, and I'm generating revenue from the plates that I sell, and they will tell me whether I made profits for the month, for the year, for the quarter, etc., and what they're telling me is what I would call a business profit. But from an economic perspective, and this is to go to the question that was just put in the chat about whether we care about economic profit in the real world. So from an economic perspective, and this is where your advisors come in, right? So maybe I have an economic advisor that would, a financial advisor should have this in their head as well, but an economic advisor would be telling me whether this was a good venture or a good deal to, or a good business to go into. In other words, this economic advisor is not just looking on the profit of the business, but he or she is also looking on whether the profit of the business is covering what I gave up. Okay, so let's say by myself right now I'm earning $100 for the year. Let's just say I'm earning $100 for the year. Then, if when I do my food truck, if the food truck itself is earning $80 for the year. So when you look at the profit of the food truck for the year, you see that it is $80. Then the economic advisor would say to me then, well, you know what? This wasn't a good business to go into because your business profit is $80, right? And that $80 cannot cover the $100 that you gave up just to start this business. So the economic profit is looking at not just the profit of the business, but whether the profit of the business is large enough to cover the foregone opportunities. So in such a case, when I talk about that 80 and that 100, the accounting profit would be 80, but the economic profit that now includes that implicit cost of $100, that's what I gave up, that now includes that implicit cost of $100, the economic profit would now be negative, and it would be minus 20, and from that perspective, I'd be told not to go into this business. So in other words, from an economic point of view, you don't care only about whether the business is doing good or not by itself as an entity, but you care about whether whatever you're generating from that business, is it large enough or sufficient enough to cover your foregone opportunities? Because if it is not covering your foregone opportunities, then you should not have foregone those opportunities. You understand what I'm saying? So this is the importance of looking at economic profit and expanding our mind beyond just thinking about whether this business is doing well or not. You have to think about, well, is it good enough? I'm glad. Is it good enough that it is covering everything else? So okay, so here's what I just said in English. So here is my example, really quickly. Or no, I don't need to give an example. Here's what I want to say. What I just said is if you're so essentially your economic profit is equal to your accounting profit. I need more space. Your economic profit is equal to your accounting profit minus your implicit cost. So your economic profit So right away, you can see that your economic profit is either equal to or less than your accounting profit. Can't spell today. And then finally, if your economic profit is greater than, if your economic profit is greater than zero, or I should say, if your economic profit is less than zero, then you would not want to get into that business, right? So your economic profit could be less than zero, and although the accounting profit is positive, you're saying that you're not covering your implicit costs, and so the economist would advise you against going into this business. So if your economic profit you would not want to be in this business, or you are, or And I say this part cautiously about saying you want to rethink about producing or continuing in this market. And I'm saying it cautiously because, as we're going to see, there are short run and long run decisions that will be made by the firm. Later on, we're going to see that when we get into Chapter 8, I believe. We're going to see that there are short run and long run decisions that are being made by the firm in terms of whether they should continue producing in this market or not. But the point that I want to say is that because your revenue is less than your opportunity cost, this is not something that you want to persist, right? It's not a sustainable, or it's not something that you want to persist and continue with into oblivion, right? Because you didn't get into the business. I mean, you went into the business to maximize profit. So that means you went into this business foregoing other opportunities to get into this business because you want to maximize your profit. You were working as a chef at a restaurant, and even though you like your boss, you felt like, you know what, I can do this on my own. I'm going to open my own restaurant. So when you left, there's a foregone opportunity existing right there. And that foregone opportunity, you want that whatever you get into, right, whatever option you choose is sufficient in its revenue to cover what you left behind. So not only must that do well for itself, by itself in an entity, but it must also produce enough to cover what you left behind. So if you're finding that your economic profit is negative, you're not going to want to sustain this forever. If you can get out of it eventually, or if this is a temporary situation, then your decisions may be slightly different. By the by, just to make a point, remember when we're getting into a business, right? So when I decided, I'm working at a restaurant, etc., and I decided that I'm going to give up my job working at a restaurant, I'm going to forego this opportunity and have my 2 food trucks in those locations that I was telling you about. You got to remember that especially if I'm not rich, right? Like I don't have money. I have to go out there and look for someone to believe in me and be willing to invest in me, aka loan me some money so that I can purchase the necessary capital equipment that I need to do this production, right? So you got to imagine that I have to have some expectation about the future, right? I got to have some, prospectus, if you will, a 5-year plan or an 8-year plan, right? When I get into a contract for the machinery and equipment, I'm probably going to get into a contract, a 5-year or a 10-year contract for the rent of the machinery and equipment or for the rent of the location, et cetera, right? And I'm going to take these costs in consideration. And I'm also going to look on the market and I'm going to see what the typical price that I can sell my good for, like what is the market price, and I'm gonna have to figure out, I'm gonna have to predict, estimate how much I'll be able to produce in a day and what that quantity will be, and then I'll be able to talk about my profit stream for the next 5 years. And all of these are expectations, of course, right? This is what I expect to earn in profit over the next 5 years. And maybe for the first year, I say, okay, I'm not going to earn as much in profit, but I expect that in year 2 and in year 3, etc., I'm going to have these high levels, this greater amount of profit. So I have to keep that in mind. I have to create my prospectus, have my plan, and when I take this plan to the person that I'm going to ask to loan me the money, right? I mean, I could always go to the bank, or I could always try to get some small business loan through the government, right? Maybe I'm living in a neighborhood where there's community development funds, etc., and they want to encourage small business organizations, so the government has money earmarked. Maybe they have grants. That's good. I don't have to borrow money. But just imagine that I'm in a situation where I have to go ask someone for money, etc. What? I have to show that this is a good deal. So my prospectus has to show some predictability that yes, this is a good thing. Yes, we expect this to happen for me to get the money that I need to start up my business and so forth, right? So my point in bringing out all of that is that I can't come up with a prospectus that is showing losses, right? Because then no one's going to give me any money if I'm saying that I'm going to be making loss over time. So I have to come up with a prospectus that is showing that I'll be making profit over, I expect to make profit over a certain number of years. And of course, my predictions have to be sound, right? I can't just get up. I have to have support for my predictions. I can't just get up and say, yeah, I'm going to make $1,000 next week, right? So I have to have that kind of support. So my point being is that the minute you start to see this kind of negative economic profit coming in, you know that this is not a good thing, and you have to start rethinking about whether you want to stay in this or not. And by the way, on the aside, while I'm talking about this, interestingly enough, there was a news article. It was either a news article I was watching a discussion on one of these channels on TV. And it was talking about the mall in New Jersey. And I said I was going to look it up, and maybe you guys know about this. The mall in New Jersey, where they were having this big mall that they're having opening up that will have all these indoor activities, these game rooms or slides or water park or et cetera, indoor activities to entertain. So the mall is not just for shopping, but it's also for having fun, et cetera. And it was coming out that, all that money and all that preparation and getting all that funds went into it. And then the pandemic hit. And social distancing came into place, and this grand opening that they were going to have wasn't coming to being. If any of you ever find that story or know about it, you could just add it into the chat, let us see about it, and share it with anyone. But but that's there are things that you can have that can shock your plan and your prospectus, and you have to rethink what you're doing. But not to stray too far off the topic, if your economic profit is equal to 0, this is not a bad thing, right? Interestingly enough, if your economic profit is equal to zero, this is not a bad thing. One thing is for sure is that you do have a positive accounting profit, right? If your economic profit is equal to zero, and this is good because it means that whatever profit your business is making, it is covering your foregone opportunities, right? So this is not a bad thing. So the the business profit covers the business profit covers the foregone opportunities, or I should say covers the implicit cost. And then of course, if our economic profit is positive, then that is a great thing. Does this mean that you can't make money doing another thing? Right. So what it means is that it's not that you can't make money doing something else. It's just that we're saying that right now the business you're in is operating sufficiently. You're sufficiently covering your implicit costs. Yes, for sure, there could be other opportunities, right? So I decided to have my food truck, and my economic profit is equal to zero. But at that point, when I'm making that decision, my foregone opportunity of my resources at that point in time included leaving my firm and leaving my business. Now, if there are other opportunities that were not taken into consideration as foregone opportunities, then we would have to revisit that situation. So it's not that we're completely closing the door, but it's more that we're saying, given the foregone opportunities that we are noting, then yes, this is what you're doing. You're making. Oh, I forgot to say, this is known as supernormal profit. I mean, now you're making normal profit. I'm sorry, let me write it, and then I say normal profit. So if your economic profit is equal to zero, then it's considered that you're making normal profit if your economic profit is equal to zero. So economic profit being equal to zero is the same as saying that you're making normal profit. If your economic profit is greater than zero, then the firm is making supernormal profit. Okay, very good. So let's look at our costs, and we're going to start off with looking at short-run costs. So where we're looking, so now we understand how to measure our costs. Now we understand that whenever we're talking about costs, you want to keep in mind this is our opportunity costs. And one way that you could think about this is just think that the cost of labor and the cost of capital actually are measuring your foregone opportunity as well. Well, that's an interesting question because talking about firms making decisions to merge, one would want to imagine, and maybe if you guys take a couple of those courses in finance, I think they have one that's called mergers and acquisitions. I'm not sure, don't quote me. But if you go deeply into looking on mergers and acquisitions, then yes, and this comes back again to that advising role that when you're looking at the decision to merge with another company, you have to think about all your opportunity costs involved. You have to think about not just whatever costs that are involved monetarily, but also foregone opportunities. If you think about McDonald's, and this just came out recently, that they are closing their store that they have, I think, in Times Square. And they said that this was a decision that was made before the pandemic because I think people were just raising the issue just because the timing that it was just closed recently. I think it was yesterday or some day this week it was closed, and I think people were trying to make that link with the pandemic and so forth, and it was coming out that no, they were going to make this closure before that, and that they had other locations further up the street on 8th Avenue and so forth. My point being is that you can imagine that when the decision comes to close, right, that you're not just thinking about these monetary costs as it in terms of, how much I'm paying my workers and so forth and whatever. But you're also thinking about foregone opportunity costs. Now, hopefully, when you look at your rental rate of capital, hopefully that rental rate of capital truly captures the foregone opportunity. It's as if when you look at interest rate, right? When you go to the bank and you borrow money and they charge you an interest rate, you're hoping that that interest rate is really capturing the price or the true, the true price or the true cost of loaning you that money right now. Because if I loan you that money right now, then it means that I am foregoing doing something else with that money. And whatever I'm foregoing doing with that money, I'm going to put a value on it, and that value is going to be reflected in our interest rate. So hopefully that's what they do. So when we think about our costs, just as when we think about production, we had our short-run production and we had our long-run production. And if you remember our production function, we had labor and capital. And I said to you, let's hold off on materials, right? And one way you can imagine materials is one, you could just lump it in with the labor unit. Or if you don't like that, you could still think about your materials as being a variable input and it has its own price different from labor, and you have your capital. But in our short run, remember our capital was fixed. So here I want to say, recall the short run production function. And with the short run production function, I had QSR is some function of labor, and I said capital is fixed, right? Continuing to ignore. And when I say continuing to ignore N for now, I mean, when we do our analysis, I can always put M back in as a variable in my equation. But we have two inputs in the short run. We have labor and capital. So you can imagine that if you're thinking about the cost of using your labor and capital, then the cost of producing QSR, that Q in the short run, is going to be equal to the total cost of labor plus the total cost of capital. So here then you can see that your labor cost, we can make it nice and simple, is equal to WL, wages, the wage rate, times labor. Right? So if I think about my labor as being labor hours or labor individual, then my labor cost is just simply this wage rate times the labor. If I'm paying my workers $100 and per day, and I'm hiring a certain number of workers per day, then my labor cost is WL. Because labor is variable, your labor cost is also variable cost. So when I think about my production function, then I can essentially say right here that my variable cost is equal to WL, right? So variable cost is VC. Labor cost is variable cost, which is the same as saying VC. And my variable cost is equal to WL. My capital cost, in a similar way, in a similar manner, I can say my capital cost is RK, where R is the price of capital. Maybe, like I said, I borrowed money, so it's an interest rate. So it's the price of capital. Or maybe I rented it, so rental rate. And if I say rental rate, then it's okay. Because if you think about it, if I borrowed money from the bank to purchase a machinery, like to purchase a computer or to purchase a food truck, then I'm paying back the bank a monthly fee. So you can imagine in an abstract way that it's really the bank's truck or really the bank's machinery, and I am paying them a rental rate for it, which, I mean, like I'm saying, I'm just trying to be abstract to just say that that rental rate is covering your interest rate as well as if you decided to rent and not purchase this machinery equipment. So in the short run then, your capital cost is fixed cost in the short run. Now, some books use FC, some books just use F. Doesn't matter which one you choose, I'm okay with it, but I just want you to realize then that we're saying your fixed cost is equal to RK. So what does this look like? So the firm's total cost function I'm going to say C is equal, oh wait, I'm going to say CSR for short run, right, is equal to WL plus RK. That is the same as saying C is equal to variable cost plus fixed cost. Maybe that's what I want to say first. So I'm going to say C is equal to variable cost plus our fixed cost. And that's the same as saying our short run function, C is equal to WL plus RK. Now, this is our cost function in general. Now, as we did with our production function, we talked about the averages and the marginals associated with our production function. So you can imagine when we're looking at our cost function, we also want to talk about marginals and averages associated with our cost function. Keeping in mind the part that I mentioned to you when we were talking about our production function. Remember, I was trying to highlight a point and saying that sometimes, even if we don't know the production function, that big complicated function in general, we can still get information about our average productivity for the month and our marginal productivity for based on the last person that we hired that month. And so in a similar way, you can think about us. Maybe we don't know. If I had an Excel spreadsheet, I probably could, plug in the numbers and get that total cost every month or every week. I plug in everything, all my expenditure, all that I'm spending on, and then I have my total cost. And I could perhaps ask Excel to generate a cost function for me, and they'll give it to me. I could easily do that. But also recognize the beauty of averages and also of marginals. So I can easily tell what is my total cost. I can tell how much money I spent this week. Or this month, and when I know how much money I spent this month, I can figure out what is my average cost, which is going to be equal to my total cost divided by quantity, and I can also figure out what is my marginal cost. So these two things become very important to us. So here's why I'm mentioning it before I'm writing it, because when we look at our average cost and our marginal cost, these are functions in terms of quantity. And if you stare at what I have here, I don't have quantity written as yet in this equation, right? So I have my cost function, just a function of some dollars, right? So this is going to, L is units times our wage, and K is units times some price. So this is giving me my cost function just in terms of dollars and in terms of labor and capital. So what I really need is my cost function in terms of quantity. So here I'm going to now say, but what is our cost function in terms of quantity? Well, if you remember our production function, right? So let's recall our production function for a minute. Our production function is QSR, is some function of L and K. I can rewrite this function, since capital is fixed, I can rewrite this function in terms of L. So I can rewrite in terms of L. I'm using too many words. So rewrite in terms of L. So if I rewrite it in terms of L, I'm going to have L, which is another function, right? Let's just call it like that. Some function of QSR, that particular quantity, and of course K bar. But K bar is going to end up being a number. So it's really L as a function of Q. L is really a function of Q. So, just so you don't feel completely lost and you say to yourself, okay, where is she going? She's going into the unknowns and walking on the adventurous side. Not really. For example, so here's my example. I'm going to put over here. What if I had Q, this is my production function, Q is equal to 2L plus 3K. And I made it linear just to show you what I'm talking about. So this is my Q, which is a function of L and K. Then I can rewrite this in terms of L. And if I rewrite this in terms of L, then I'm going to get L is equal to Q minus 3K divided by 2. And so this would be my L. Oh, wait, before I do that, I can also say, and if, if I made K equal to 6, then my L is equal to Q minus, I forgot, what is 3 6s? Exactly, I'm waiting.
Q minus 9.
Q minus 9, thank you so much. So this would be Q minus 9 over 2. No, Q over 2 minus 9. So it would be Q over 2 minus 9.
Yeah.
And that would be my function L as a function of just Q. So I would get L as a function of just Q here because I'd have L is equal to Q, my QSR, whatever that is, my QSR over 2 minus 9. So if I get L as a function of Q, then I can substitute this into my cost function. So I now have CSR is equal to W times G, which is a function of Q, plus RK. And RK is already a fixed number, so my CSR is just equal to W times G, which is a function of Q, plus F, because that's a fixed number. And so I can write my cost function as a function of quantity. At the end of the day, I will get my cost function as a function of quantity. If I mean, continuing with this example here, if you notice I have L minus QSR over minus N. If I had a cost function, let's say I said C is, so let's just do this, arrow. So you know, we continue. If I had C is equal to, and let's say W is 10L plus, and my R is 65K, then basically I'm going to say my CSR is equal to 10 times Q over 2 minus 9 plus 65K. That's what I'm doing. And we know that K is equal to 6. So we know that K is equal to 6. So 65 times 6 is equal to 390. So I have CSR is equal to 10Q divided by 2 minus 90 plus 390. I have my CSR is equal to 5Q plus 300. So here's the thing. I'm not going to ask you guys to go too far and too deep, I realize, but what part of this is an appreciation of where we're getting our cost function and the link between the two of them. I will. And the link between the two of them. So let me just scroll back up and let me just talk it over again, just to make sure we're all together. So I am trying to find my cost functions in terms of Q. I know my cost function CSR is equal to WL plus RK. And I can rewrite, you know, the question is, how do I get my cost function in terms of quantity? Well, I know my production function. So if I rewrite my production function in terms of L, I can get L is a function of Q. And so in this example, I have this production function, Q is equal to 2L plus 3K. And I rewrite it in terms of L. So Q minus 3K is equal to 2L. So Q minus 3K divided by 2 is equal to L. And this is my production function in terms of L, labor. And since I already know that K is equal to 6, then I am going to plug in the 6 here, and 3 times 6, as someone told me in the chat, is 18. And 18, so I have Q minus 18 divided by 2. So 18 divided by 2 on a good sunny day is 9. So then I can rewrite this as L is equal to Q divided by 2 minus 9. And so this L function is this over here. So that's your link right there. And then now that I have it, I can substitute it into the cost function. So when I substitute my L into the cost function, I get C is equal to 10L. So I mean, I have a cost function. C is equal to, so I could say let C equal to 10L, let the cost function be. C is equal to 10L plus 65K. And once I have that cost function there, then I can plug in for L, which is Q over 2 minus 9. And then I remember that my K is 6, it is fixed, and 6 times 65 on a good day is 390, and 10 times Q over 2, and 10 times 9, which is minus 90. And so I get my cost function. So with my cost function in terms of quantity, I can now find marginal costs and average variable cost. And basically, it's a short run cost in terms of quantity. We can now find marginal cost and average variable cost. Right? So let me just introduce what they are, as you would have guessed. So your marginal cost, which is MC. This is your change in total cost resulting from a change in quantity. Right? So your marginal cost is equal to the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity, which is equal to the derivative of your cost function, which is written in terms of quantity, with respect to quantity. So you want to be able to remember this. Then to really quickly talk about our averages, we have, let me use a new page. To talk about our averages, we have our average variable cost, which is your AVC. And this is your variable cost per unit. Right? And so your average variable cost is going to be equal to your variable cost divided by quantity. Right? So you're going to take, and remember that this variable cost is a function of quantity, right? Divided by quantity. The point that I want to make here, why I say remember your variable cost is a function of quantity, because when you look on your cost equation, when you go back to looking on your cost equation, one thing that you want to realize is that wherever you have quantity written in that cost equation, that is your variable cost. That is a portion that changes with output. So if you look on this that we have right here, I want you guys to realize that this portion is your variable cost, and this portion is your fixed cost. Okay, so your variable cost is that portion that changes with quantity. Your fixed cost, of course, does not change with quantity. If you look on our little example here in the green, then you would call 5Q your variable cost, and you would call 300 your fixed cost. Because notice, if I change my quantity if I increase my quantity, 300 is going to remain 300, but 5Q will change as I change my quantity. So this is your average variable cost. Then we have our average fixed cost, believe it or not. And this is the fixed cost per unit. And so you can calculate your average fixed cost to be equal to your fixed cost divided by quantity. And this is a dollar amount. So there's, this is a dollar amount. Right away, you should be able to notice that your average fixed cost decreases with quantity, because your numerator is going to remain fixed, which it is fixed cost. Your numerator is going to remain fixed. And as your denominator increases, your average fixed cost is just going to decrease with quantity. So if you put it all together, then you can imagine we have our average total cost, AVE, on a good day. And your average total cost, we usually write it as ATC. And this is your cost per unit. And your average total cost is going to be equal to that cost function divided by quantity. And so it's the entire cost function that we have divided by quantity. No surprise, your average total cost is equal to average fixed cost plus average variable cost. Okay, all right. So the next thing that we can do right now, or what we're going to get into, is looking at the cost functions and looking at the relationship between these cost functions and our production function in the short run. But what I want to do is take a break. So let us imagine that we had, or like I said, our cost function can be linear and our cost function can be nonlinear. So for just briefly, let us imagine a linear cost function. And just for completeness, let's use the cost function we have from the example, just so that we would have, you can when you're looking back on the notes, you'll be able to have something to follow with. So we're going to use this cost function that we had in green here, where the cost function is equal to 5q plus 300, and that's the cost function that we're going to use for our linear cost function. Okay. So if I wanted to graph this cost function, if I wanted to graph it, this would be my quantity, and this would be my cost. It will start out when quantity is equal to 0. I have a cost of $300. So even if I'm producing nothing, I have a cost of $300. So that would be, I have to pay the rent on the building, or I have to pay back interest on the loans I took out, regardless of whether I am producing or not. So this cost is in terms of dollars, and this would be our function going into that direction. This would be our CSR of Q. Right? So for instance, at Q equals to, if I'm producing 100 units of quantity, then we know that the cost to produce 100 units would be $800. And so this is what it would look like if it was a linear cost function. Similarly, using that linear cost function, and my linear cost function is 5q plus 300. So I can determine my average variable cost. My average variable cost is going to be equal to it's going to be equal to my variable cost divided by quantity, which is equal to 5q divided by quantity, which is equal to 5. My average fixed cost is going to be equal to my fixed cost divided by quantity, which is equal to 300 divided by my quantity. And that's it. It's a function. And my average total cost is going to be equal to my cost function divided by quantity, which is going to be equal to 5 plus 300 over Q. So what would this look like? More importantly, I mean, we don't talk a lot about our average fixed cost because, it's just decreasing. What we care about is the relationship between our average variable cost and our average total cost. And so if I were to graph this, putting quantity on my x-axis, and on my y-axis, I have average total cost and average variable cost, remembering that these are dollar amounts. My average variable cost is constant. It doesn't change. My average variable cost is equal to $5, right? So no matter what quantity I'm producing, I'm spending $5 per unit to produce that particular quantity. My average total cost, however, if you look on it, it's 5 plus 300 over Q. So you can see that my average total cost is not equal to my average variable cost. In fact, it is greater than my average variable cost, which is no surprise because I have fixed costs. So which one? Which one are you asking if it is fixed or variable? The 5 is it's variable cost, but it's a constant variable cost. So I would say here that my variable cost is constant, or average variable cost. Is constant and equal to equal to $5. I know it seems kind of right. I think I see your question. So it looks as if it seems as if, oh wait, I thought you said it's variable cost. But remember that what variable cost, your total variable cost, is cost that varies with your quantity. And so if we look on this portion of our linear function, this is our total variable cost, and that is the portion that varies with the quantity. If I'm producing 1 unit, my total variable cost is $5. If I produce 2, my total variable cost is 10, and 3, it's 15, and so forth. So it is the variable cost that varies with quantity. It is possible that even though your variable cost is varying with quantity, the variation is constant. So in other words, as I am increasing my output, my average is not changing at all. So that variation or that addition remains the same per unit. So it's not changing. Later on, when I talk about the nonlinear cost function, we're going to see an average variable cost that actually changes, that decreases or increases as you are producing more and more units. But when we talk about variable cost versus fixed cost, remember that the focus is on the total. And as long as the total is changing with the quantity, then it's variable cost. But the average is a per unit. So I'm still doing the same per unit. So if I look at the graph of my average variable cost, it's, each unit is costing me the same. Basically, that's what that is saying. That's another way to say it. So to produce it, each unit is costing me the same to produce it. But for sure, okay, good. For sure that I am seeing that my variable cost is changing. But if you look, so back to what I was saying, if you look at your average total cost, if you look at your average total cost, which is 5 plus 300 over Q, and your average variable cost, your average total cost is not equal to your average variable cost. And in fact, we can say your average total cost is greater than your average variable cost. So as long as your fixed cost exists, as long as you have fixed cost, your average total cost is greater than your average variable cost. And maybe I should say that all the way here. So this is just an aside right here, that as long as actually should have probably said it all the way here where I'm saying, yeah. So here I should say, as long as average fixed cost is positive, so as long as there is fixed cost and my average fixed cost is positive, so as long as I have average fixed cost, so there is a fixed cost and I have an average, then my average total cost is greater than my average variable cost. It's important for me to say that because I want to say that my average total cost curve is always going to be lying above the average variable cost curve. So my average total cost curve always, in graphical terms, it is always a curve that is above the average variable cost. And if you look at your average total cost, as you increase your quantity, your average total cost is decreasing. And not only that, but you notice that as your quantities get larger and larger, like, after you pass 300 and you're getting larger and larger, the increase starts to become asymptotic. So you have that sharp decrease. So this is your average total cost, and this is your average variable cost. So, it never touches, right? It never touches, you can imagine that when Q is equal to 50, then my average total cost is equal to, why did I use 50? Yeah, then my average total cost is equal to 11. Okay, so if you look back on this, when Q is equal to 50, my average total cost is equal to 11, my average variable cost is equal to 5. So 11 is all the way up here. And then once my Q has surpasses 300, now I'm using Q is equal to 600, then my average total cost is equal to 5.5, while my average variable cost is equal to just 5. So this is what it would look like if it was a linear cost function. Now let's look at having a nonlinear cost function. Let me see. Consider a nonlinear cost function, which is typically what we will see. So typically what we would play with, so I want to say here is to consider. And if you think about it, for those of us who are adventurous, remember we do have some of us here that are adventurous. If you go back and you look at how we came up with our cost function as a function of quantity, you can imagine that there could be a way that we could get it into a nonlinear form based on our production function. In this example, I gave you a production function that was actually linear. More importantly, my production function was kind of a substitute, even though I told you guys we weren't going to look at substitutes, but I used it just to make it easy for us to visualize what was happening when we wrote our production function in terms of labor and substituted it into our cost function. So you can imagine having a production function that is nonlinear, like our typical Cobb-Douglas production function. Once I start, and that's what the adventurous want, you could play with this later on after class. Once I write that production function as labor as a function of quantity and capital, you can see where it starts to get into a nonlinear form, right? My Q is probably going to be to the 0.5 or squared or something, right? Now my Q won't be raised to 1 power. I'm going to have Q raised to some power that is not 1. And once I start to have that, when I plug that into my cost function, then my cost function now becomes nonlinear. And so, this typical situation is not a far-fetched situation. And like I said, you can practice. So I say typical here because at the onset we had said we were going to not consider production functions that use labor and capital in a perfectly substitutable kind of way, and we're only going to focus on those production functions that have that use a labor capital combination. In such a situation, just graphically, we'd have our cost function looking like this. This is our C, and this is our Q. We have well, I should have started it. Like this, where this value is, of course, your fixed cost, and this is your total cost here. And of course, if I wanted, I could do a horizontal line for my fixed cost and so forth. But we have a graph in such a manner. Ooh, I forgot one thing. How could I ever? There was a calculation that I forgot. No one told me about it. So we calculated our average variable cost, our average fixed cost, and our average total cost from this linear cost function. But we didn't calculate our marginal cost. You were a little bit too quick. So I am going to stick it right here. And I'm going to say your marginal cost is equal to the derivative of your cost function with respect to quantity. And as it turns out, your marginal cost is equal to 5. So, and that's what it just hit me right here. That a takeaway from this is that for linear cost function, as it turns out, your marginal cost is equal to your average variable cost for your linear cost function. So here we have this total cost function, and then I'm just going to really quickly graph or what we would see typically for your average variable cost and your average fixed cost from this kind of relationship. And typically we would have our average variable cost decreases, reaches a minimum, and then it increases. Our average total cost would also decrease, reach a minimum, and then it increases. But to make a point, and then of course we have our marginal cost. To make a point here, that your average total cost will reach a minimum before your average variable cost will reach a minimum at a level of output that is lower than when your average total cost reaches a minimum. So we could call that Q0, Q1. But also to recognize that marginal cost is equal to average total cost and average variable cost when these are at a minimum. So the takeaway from this part is to realize that there is a relationship between our marginal cost and our average variable cost. And I threw the graph up, but let's look at it. This is ABC, this is MC, and this is your ATC, and these are all dollar amounts. So how did I get all the way there, talking about there's this relationship between your marginal cost and your average variable cost? Turns out that when you try to graph it, you're going to notice that in a nonlinear situation, your average variable cost decreases, reaches a minimum, and then it begins to increase. Similarly to how we had our average product increasing, reaching a maximum, and then decreasing. And our average total cost will do the same kind of situation. There is also a relationship between the marginal and the average. And the relationship is that if your marginal cost is less than your average variable cost, then your average variable cost is decreasing with output. And this is the same spiel that I've given before, where I talked about your costs decreasing, where you're having, if your marginal is less than your average, the marginal is pulling down the average. And if the marginal is greater than the average, the marginal is pulling up the average. So it's just similar as when we talked about with marginal productivity and average productivity. And if your marginal cost is equal to your average total cost, then, variable cost we're talking about here, is equal to your average variable cost, then your average variable cost is at a minimum. I'm going to give an example to show why we can see, or why is it that we realize our costs decrease, reaches a minimum, and then increase. Why is that happening? In other words, why is it my cost is not increasing, my average cost is not increasing altogether? I'm gonna give you an example just now, but I just want to make sure that we get these out. In a similar way, I can talk about my marginal cost and my average total cost. Similarly, if my marginal cost is greater than my average total cost, my average total cost is decreasing with output. And if my marginal cost is greater, let's, 1 minute. If my marginal cost is greater than my average total cost, then my average total cost is increasing with output. And then finally, of course, if my marginal cost is equal to my average total cost is at minimum. Now, if you look back on our linear cost function, and when we looked at the averages for our linear cost function, notice that my marginal cost is equal to my average variable cost, and my average variable cost is at a minimum, right? It's not changing at all for all levels of output. But also importantly, notice my marginal cost is always less than my average total cost. So my average total cost is always decreasing. But how did I come to this conclusion that my cost is decreasing with output and then increasing, right? What made me come to that conclusion? I'm going to talk about it just now. Before I talk about it, I just want to draw your attention to this minor detail, minor but important detail with our graph. So to notice that the distance between my average total cost and my average variable cost is much larger at lower quantities than at higher quantities. Because as we know, average fixed cost is just decreasing with output. So as you get to higher levels of output, that average fixed cost is getting smaller and smaller. And so the distance between average total and average variable should get smaller and smaller. And then of course, now I'm going to talk about that marginal cost behavior. So let's look at an example. We're just going to consider an example. How or why? Question? And coverages at marginal cost, yes. So let me explain. So that's what I want to say. I'm explaining the shape of the average cost curve. Okay. So how can we explain? So let's use an example. And in our example, if I can pull it up real quickly, let's imagine that. So I'm going to change my my firm. So I know I've been talking about the food truck and so forth, but I'm going to change my firm and I'm going to talk about a car wash. And I know that we have all, and I like the car wash because we've either seen it, been through it, or we've seen it on TV. Whether you saw it live, you went through a car wash with your car, or if you don't have a car, you've never been through a car wash, you have actually seen it on TV. I'm pretty sure there must have been a show that had a car wash. But let's imagine, so instead of doing my food truck, and also to go to one of the things that somebody said in the message, whether there are other opportunities, let's just say I decide away with the food truck business, I'm going to open a car wash. I notice there are a lot of dirty cars. So here's my example, and I'm gonna put it out like this. So in my example, I have workers, right? So these are my workers L, and I can have no worker, and Q is the number of cars serviced. So when I have no workers, the number of cars I'm servicing is equal to 0. And I can talk about my marginal product of labor. I can talk about my average product of labor, right? I can talk about the cost of doing this. And then I can also talk about my marginal cost. Let's put this in another color. I can also talk about my marginal cost. And I can also talk about my average variable cost. Okay, let's put this cost in a different color. Okay. And so this Q is the number of cars serviced. per day. And let us in this situation, this is my labor. Number of workers. And you know what? Let's just make this be my variable cost. I'll tell you why later. Okay. So when I have nobody working at my car wash, you know, I have the automated line and everything. When I have no one working at the car wash, then I'm not able to service any car. Imagine it's not one of those, you know, where you can actually drive through by yourself. You don't have someone working out there. I mean, you do have those, they exist. I've seen them in the South. But let's just imagine that I need someone to be there. You can't just drive in and go through them. So when I hire one person, right? When I hire one person, this one person would actually greet the customer, take their money, actually drive the car, put it on the conveyor belt, and then they will, you know, turn on the switches and everything, and then they would actually go around to the front and collect the car when it comes off the conveyor belt, and maybe they would, you know, dry it off a little bit. Now they have those dryers, so they, you know, he has a little chamois cloth. He would wipe it down a little bit and give the car over to the customer. So you imagine one person doing all of that. At the end of the day, the most cars that I can service would be 30. All right. So the most cars I can service would be 30 cars in a day, because this guy is doing all this work. The most he can do is 30. So in that kind of situation, my marginal product, as you can tell, would be the change in quantity over the change in labor. So I'm changing my quantity from 0 to 30, right? So 30 minus 0 over the change in labor, which is 1 minus 0. So my marginal product is equal to 30. My average product is also equal to 30, because my average product, remember, is going to be quantity divided by labor. So average product is quantity divided by labor. Marginal is that change. So everything is 30 and 30. Well, what is my variable cost? I need to know how much I'm paying my workers. And let's say that the total cost, I hire one guy and I'm paying him $100. I know, go figure. But for now, just to make her life easy, I mean, I could have said $10, but let's just say I am paying him $100 to clean those 30 cars in a day, or 30 cars in a week, if that makes it better for you to understand $100. So here, for my variable cost, I'm going to say that my variable cost is equal to W times L, and I'm going to say it is equal to 100 times L. So that is my variable cost. So when I hire one person, I'm actually spending $100. So when I hire no one, I'm spending $0. And my marginal cost, as you would imagine, is going to be the change in my total cost divided by the change in quantity. So here's a little thing that I didn't say on the aside, but if you think about what's happening with your marginal cost, your marginal cost is equal to the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity, or the derivative of your total cost function with respect to quantity. That is your marginal cost. But what I want you to notice here is that and this actually I need to say somewhere, so I'm gonna have to put it somewhere, because I don't want this to escape you. That your marginal cost is equal to, okay, wait a minute. Okay, your marginal cost is equal to, okay, wait a minute. So your marginal cost is actually equal to the change in total cost when you change quantity. And your total cost, or you know, you find the derivative of total cost with respect to quantity. So the change in total cost, if you think about it, when I'm changing my quantity, the only thing that is changing with total cost is the variable cost, because my fixed cost is not changing when I change my quantity. So as I increase or produce more and more quantity, my fixed cost is not changing. That remains the same. And so the only thing that's changing is my marginal cost. So really and truly, I can call my marginal cost the change in my total variable cost with respect to quantity, and I can ignore the fixed cost. And for those of us who are adventurous and you want to play with this later on this evening or tomorrow, when you look at your cost function, remember that fixed cost is just a number. So when you take the derivative with respect to the fixed cost, which is just a number, when you take that derivative, that constant is going to go to 0. So really your marginal cost only depends on your variable cost. And so I can call my marginal cost the change in variable cost when I change quantity, and I will not be losing anything by saying that. So here I'm going to say my marginal cost is the change in variable cost divided by the change in quantity. I'm not going to lose anything by saying that. And then to remember, my average variable cost is variable cost divided by quantity. So here, when I hired one worker, I was able to increase my quantity by 30, and the cost of doing that is that I changed my variable cost to 100. So the change in variable cost is 100, and 100 divided by the change in quantity, which is 30, gives me $3.33. So right here, I have $3.33. Similarly, my average variable cost is 100 divided by 30, so it's also $3.33. Okay, let's get back to this part though. This is what I want to talk about. So I hire a second worker. When I hired a second worker, because the one worker doing all the running around, he complained a little bit to me. So I said, okay, I'll hire a second worker. When I hire the second worker, I'm able to service, or they are able to service, a total of 80 cars in one day. So with the second worker, maybe I have one person at the front collecting the car, collecting the money and putting it on the conveyor, and one person at the back or at the end who takes the car after it comes through the car wash, drives it off and gives it to the customer. So I'm able to, with division of labor, I'm able to service more than 30 cars in a week or in a day. I'm able to service 80 cars. But importantly, notice that when I'm able to service 30 cars, that my marginal product is 50. So the second guy, the additional service, the additional output that I'm getting from the second guy is 50. Because I hired him, I'm able to produce, or I'm able to service 50 more cars. And on average, notice that I am doing 40. So right away, we notice when I hire the second guy, the marginal product is greater than the average product. So my average product is increasing. Things are looking up. I decide to hire the third guy. I hire the third guy. When I hire the third guy, I am getting 120 car service. One guy collects the money and talks. Does the customer care? The second guy is the one who actually puts it on the conveyor belt. So two guys in the front, one is talking to the customer, the other one is putting the car on the conveyor belt. And the third guy stays around at the other end collecting the car. So I'm able to do 120 cars. I'm servicing 120 cars. That third guy, the marginal product is equal to 40. How did I calculate marginal product to remind ourselves? 120 minus 80, so it's the change in output, over the change in labor. So maybe I should write that here so that you remember. It's the change in output over the change in labor for your marginal product. All right. Change in output over the change in labor. And so, and your average product, of course, is Q divided by L. So that the third guy is bringing 40, right? So less than what the second guy brought, right? However, the average product is also 40. Let's do one more guy. I hire one more guy, guy number 4. With guy number 4, I'm able to service 150 cars. With servicing 150 cars, the marginal product from the fourth guy is 30, right? 150 minus 120 on a good day is 30. And the average product is 37.5, right? Maybe I'm wrong. 150 divided by 4 on a good day is equal to 37.5. So what do we observe in terms of productivity? In terms of productivity, so far we're noticing that your output is increasing with your labor, right? So that's the first thing we notice, output is increasing with your labor. Not only are we noticing that output is increasing with your labor, but we're noticing that what? That it is increasing at a decreasing rate. I mean, eventually it begins to increase at a decreasing rate. So we noticed that your marginal productivity was increasing, right? So there was some increasing returns to scale, increasing marginal returns. But we noticed that eventually we started to see decreasing marginal returns. That after the second guy, when we're hiring, we're getting greater output, but it is increasing at a decreasing rate. Not only that, we noticed that whenever your marginal product, we noticed at the labor, we noticed that the labor where your marginal product is greater than your average product, where it is equal to your average product, and where it is less than your average product. So if we ignore hiring one guy, which is the initial state, if we ignore that for a minute, then we notice that at our second guy, marginal product is greater than average product, so my average product is increasing. At the third guy, marginal product is equal to average product, so my average product is at a maximum. And at the fourth guy, marginal product is less than my average product, so average product is decreasing. So at L equals 2, average product is increasing. At L equals 3, average product is at a maximum. And at L equals 4, average product is decreasing. So our typical shape. But what implication does this have on cost? Well, let's look on what's happening with our cost. When I hire guy number 2, I'm paying them each $100. So my variable cost is now $200. At guy number 3, my variable cost is $300. And at guy number 4, my variable cost is $400 because I'm paying them $100, right? But what does that mean about marginal cost? Well, at guy number 2, when I hire guy number 2, the additional cost incurred is going to be 200 minus 100, which is 100, divided by 80 minus 30, which is 50. So I'm going to notice that this is going to end up being 100 divided by 50. So my marginal cost is equal to 2. Similarly, thank you. Similarly, when I calculate here, when I hire guy number 3, my marginal cost is going to be 300 minus 200, which is 100, divided by my change in output is 120 minus 80, which is 40. So here it's going to be 2.5, $2.50. And finally, when I hire guy number 4, my marginal cost is going to be 100 divided by 30, which is $3.33. So here's something that I noticed. When I'm hiring guy number 2, the additional productivity that he brought to me was greater, right? My marginal product was increasing. But so he's doing much more than guy number 1, but I'm paying him the same amount of money to produce the output, so my additional cost is decreasing. When I get to guy number 3 and guy number 4, they are bringing me lower additional output, but I'm paying them the same amount of money, so my marginal cost is now increasing. A similar thing occurs with my average variable cost. With my average variable cost, if you do 200 divided by the quantity of 80, you're going to get an average variable cost of 2.5 here when you hire 2 people. When I'm producing 120, 3 people, my average variable cost is going to be 300 divided by 120, so that's also going to be 2.5. And at 4, I'm going to have my average variable cost being equal to 2.67. So we notice the opposite is occurring. That when my average product increases, reaches a maximum at 3, and then decreases. I notice that my average variable cost decreases, reaches a minimum, and then it increases. What is happening? If I am getting more output out of a labor that I'm paying the same amount of money, right? So if I'm getting more output of labor unit number 2 than I did out of labor unit number 1, but I'm paying them the same amount of money, then my cost is decreasing. Do you feel that? So if I hire one of you and you produce a certain amount of output for me and I'm paying you per hour and you produce a certain amount of output in that hour, great. But if I hire your friend and your friend is now producing more than you in that 1 hour, then my average cost is decreasing, because when I look at the total that I'm getting a lot more out of your friend and I'm paying them the same amount of money, so to produce a lot more, so my cost is decreasing. But when we get into the part where my average product now starts to decrease, right? Now, I'm hiring, but on average, I'm getting less and less and less out of my workers, then now my cost is going to start to increase. Because now the marginal productivity of my additional worker is going down, but I'm still paying you the same amount of money to produce less than your predecessor, then my cost is going to start increasing. So there's an opposite relationship between your marginals and your averages that will allow you to say, I mean, if you look at it at L equals 2, let's just say at L equals 2, I notice that my marginal product of labor is greater than my average product of labor, and my marginal cost is less than my average variable cost. So it allows me to say here that my average product of labor is increasing with labor, and my average variable cost is decreasing with output. Similarly, at L equals to 3, well, let me do 4 before I do 3, and you'll see why. At L equals to 4, I notice that my marginal product of labor is less than my average product of labor, and my marginal cost is greater than my average variable cost. So my average product of labor is decreasing with labor, and my average variable cost is increasing. Yes, I know, with output. So everything disappeared. Okay, so my average variable cost is increasing with output. It won't allow me to erase it. So when L is equal to 3, my marginal product, finally on this point, is that when at L equals to 3, my marginal product of labor is equal to my average product of labor, and my marginal cost is equal to my average variable cost. So I know that my average product of labor is at a maximum, and my average variable cost is at a minimum. Okay. So this is how you can see that that change around with that relationship between your costs and your productivity, your average cost and your average productivity. There is that very nice relationship between the two of them. On a final note on this, this is one thing that I wanted to add, another way that you can look at this. Recall, we said that our cost function is equal to W times L plus our fixed cost, right? And then recall that we made L being equal to a function of is equal to some function of quantity. Then look at this. If I write my marginal cost to be equal to the change in total cost, okay? So let me do this. If I write my marginal cost to be equal to the derivative of my cost function with respect to quantity, this is what we noted. It is the derivative of the cost function with respect to quantity. Then recognize that what? Essentially, we're talking about W times the derivative of L with respect to quantity. If you look at your cost function, if I'm going to take this derivative, then essentially I'm saying it's equal to W times the derivative of L with respect to quantity. Your DL dQ, if you remember, is equal to MPL. And because your DL dQ is equal to MPL, you should be able to then write W over your MPL. Okay, so I think my time ran out. I'm going to finish writing this up and